Hi, everybody. Welcome. I'm Judy Clem, and on behalf of the Friends of the Oak Park Conservatory, we are so glad to welcome you to tonight's Learn and Grow lecture on plant dividing. The timing for this program could not be better because now is the time to get out there and divide your plants, of course. The Learn and Grow series began several years ago as a lead-in to our annual plant sale. The free program every week in April is our way to help educate and inspire gardeners to become more confident in their endeavors. Did you know, this is my did you know moment, the Oak Park Conservatory began as a community effort to provide a place to house exotic plants that residents collected during their travels abroad. Completed in 1929, it is now on the list of the National Register of Historic Places. The Friends of the Oak Park Conservatory is a nonprofit organization that supports the conservatory. We offer a wide range of programs focusing on enriching the visitor experience at the conservatory. From volunteering to educational and recreational opportunities, tours and classes, there is something we offer for everyone. This year, we are celebrating our 35th anniversary in this community. We have many special events and programs in the works, and of course, our annual plant sale is underway, and it opens to the public on this Saturday. Now, it is my great pleasure to introduce our special guests this evening. We have Nera Mimunovic, the Extension Program Coordinator in Horticulture at the University of Illinois Extension. She is joined by our presenter, Master Gardener Kayla Chase. Adrienne Iyer is our new volunteer program and events coordinator, and she's helping manage the Zoom room. I will watch the chat box for your questions, and I will navigate questions Q&A at the end of our program. So at this time, Nera, would you like me to spotlight you?
Oh, no, you're fine.
Okay, I'm going to spotlight Kayla.
Sounds good.
Okay. Nera's going to speak about Kayla, and then we'll have Kayla take it away.
Awesome. I just want to start off by thanking you so much for having us. We love working with the Friends of the Oak Park Conservatory, so we're happy to be back. Again, my name is Nera Mimunovic, and I serve as the Extension Program Coordinator for Horticulture in North Cook County. So I want to start and give a little bit about Extension. It's the flagship outreach effort of the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Extension offers educational programs to residents of all 102 counties in Illinois and far beyond. The North Cook County program serves the suburban Cook County area with the mission of helping others learn to grow. So we ask that you keep your videos off and your microphones muted throughout the program, as this presentation will be recorded. We will have time at the end of the program for questions, so please submit them through the chat box function at the bottom of your screen. And in the future, you can always email your plant and garden questions to the North Cook County Master Gardener Answer Desk. Details will be provided in the chat throughout the program about this. Tonight, part 2 of the Learn and Grow program will be presented by Illinois Master Gardener and FOPCON board member Kayla Chase. Kayla is a recently certified Master Gardener with Illinois Extension. She is also currently an active member of the Illinois Native Plant Society and the Midwest Fruit Explorers. In addition to her volunteering, she works as a medical science liaison for a pharmaceutical company and is currently renovating her home. Please welcome Kayla.
Hi guys, thank you so much. Let me share my screen really fast. Okay, perfect. So thank you guys. Hi everyone. It's so great to see so many people I know on this call today. Thank you all for coming. So today I'm going to be talking about dividing perennials. So please, again, it's been said before, but put your questions in the chat, but also put any tips and tricks that you guys have. We're kind of doing a broad strokes about dividing perennials. There's always more to learn, and that's the best part about these talks is we get to learn from each other. So please, I would love to hear from people that know more than me. So this talk has 3 main objectives. So we are going to understand when to divide a perennial, identify some ideal root structures for division, and then go through some steps for how best to divide a perennial. So ideally, after this talk, tomorrow or this weekend, you can go outside, and even if we haven't discussed the finer details of your specific plant in your backyard or front yard, you now have kind of the basis and the confidence to go out there and begin to tackle this. So what is plant division? So the technical definition is a form of vegetative propagation where each piece is capable of producing both roots and shoots. So this is not using seeds. We're not going to talk about seeds at all. We're going to be talking about plants that will be growing in your backyard right about now. So why do you divide perennials? There's kind of three main reasons, and we're going to dive more into this as we get more specific. But the first reason is landscape design, right? So if your perennial is incredibly robust, it could be beginning to crowd out the surrounding plants, right? Maybe it's just taking over, and so now it's time to divide it. Also, it's free plants, right? Perennials are resilient; they bounce back after division. So go ahead, divide them up, give them to friends. It's a great way to make friends, or spread them, across your lawn. But also plant health, and this is something we're going to dive more into as we get more specific. But when you think about plant health, over time, your perennial is going to be sending up new roots, new shoots, and then over time, these roots and shoots tend to crowd out each other. So when they're competing for light, for water, for nutrients, the clump can be getting bigger and the clump itself can be looking healthy, but each individual plant could be losing some vigor, right? And you see that sometimes with decreased flowering. You see that sometimes with yellowing of leaves, or sometimes, in the most canonical example, is when you see these grasses and the center starts to die out. And again, we're going to talk more about this, but these are all signs that the plant needs to be divided. Overall, kind of everything we talk about, the best rule of thumb to divide, and I'll say this multiple times, every 3 to 5 years, depending on the plant vigor and depending on other circumstances. But we'll talk more about that in detail. So root structure, it really significantly impacts how you're going to divide those plants. Sorry, my cat's jumping up here. So the way I structured this talk is we're actually going to be dividing and discussing based on the root structure. And so there's a reason for this, obviously, so that we're not going to be able to talk about every single plant specifically. But if you can figure out the root structure, you can look it up, or if then you know how best to begin dividing. So some of the types of roots we're going to talk about today are going to be the fibrous roots, your grasses, which is an example there, your taproots, which are going to be an example as your carrot, the bulbs and corms, and in that picture you can see looks like some hyacinths and some daffodils. Your rhizomes, which in this picture we have some lilies of the valley, your tubers, which is going to be your caladium, which is that nice, beautiful red leaf. We're going to talk a little bit about tree suckers, and then also runners and stolons, which the prime example of that is always going to be your strawberries. So when you're dividing, there's two main type of root structures you kind of want to avoid. And the first being that single taproot. So a single taproot, is going to be that primary root that gives out branches of secondary and tertiary root structures growing down, but the primary root tapers to the end. The single plant can only have a single taproot. So the prime example of that is going to be your carrot, right? As delicious as they are, maybe don't try to divide them, but also your butterfly weed, right? Another root structure to kind of stay away from is those shrub-like perennials with that single woody base. Two examples of this are going to be your lavender and then your Russian sage. I'm not saying it can't be divided, but also maybe there's some thought that maybe they don't necessarily need to be divided. These can maybe be pruned back. They both make a copious amounts of seeds. You can grow them from seeds. And so unlike some of the other plants we're going to talk about, maybe you don't even really necessarily need to. One thing I want to stress is, even though I'm talking about staying away from dividing these plants, with plants I never want to make a hard and fast line. Because every time I've ever said oh, never do this, someone's like, oh, by the way, I've done that and it's great. And you're like, of course, plants are dynamic that way. So maybe just, there's so many other things you can do in your garden, so many, easier things to do. So maybe just stray away from those at the beginning. So one thing I kind of want to talk about is root suckers. So this is generally seen on trees. So what are root suckers? So they're vigorously growing sprouts that come from root tissues. they're arising from an adventitious bud. So this is actually one of my neighbor's trees, and I should probably go talk to them and tell them to maybe address this, but either way, I took a picture. So really, why does a tree form root suckers? So there's a couple reasons, and none of them are particularly great for wanting to divide. So some species are more prone to suckering than others. For example, the ornamental crabapple, it's more prone to suckering. But there's a lot of times when the tree is stressed, it will put out suckers. So sometimes they'll put out suckers in an attempt to develop more limbs so they can overcome injury or stress. Sometimes pests or different disease can stimulate the tree to putting on more sprouts. Age also may be a factor. So trees might not sucker when they're young, but they will when they're older. And it's kind of like an attempt to start new trees. The other reason that trees can sucker, and you see this a lot with apple trees, is they sucker around that graft union. So, and I don't want to get too lost in the weeds here, but when with apple trees, you have a rootstock and it's grafted to that apple tree that, with the apples that you so love and enjoy. But a lot of times those rootstocks are chosen because they reproduce easily, right? And so if there's an issue with that graft union, sometimes that rootstock can start sending up its own suckers, and then those aren't the tree that you want anyway. But let's say you're absolutely bent on growing these suckers into a tree, then that's fine. Do it in the springtime. New growth has started. Select a nice, healthy, vigorous sucker. Use a clean shovel to kind of dig around the sucker and look to see if it has its own independent root structure. If it does, go ahead and dig it up, and now you have a new tree. If not, you can cover it and wait a few months and see if it does. And then, when it eventually will, you can have a new tree. For this tree, I would suggest that they actually just prune them back. And probably what this is coming from is it's probably getting some damage from the lawnmower. So, obviously you want to mulch around your trees. So the second type of structure we're going to talk about is your runners and stolons. So these are, segmented horizontal stems that remain above the ground. So they arise from another adventitious bud that's within the crown of that strawberry. So the prime example is that strawberry, and there's two great pictures there, actually taken by Neighbor. So the crown of the strawberry plant is this short, thick stem, and it has growing points slightly, maybe about a centimeter above the surface of the ground, and then underneath the ground is that bushy root structure. So what you can do is then a stolon or a runner will come out, and it will begin to establish what's known as a daughter plant. So you can plant those in separate containers, and then once they're established, you actually just clip off that stolon right near, as close as possible to the daughter plant, and now you have a new strawberry. It's an incredibly easy way to get strawberries. There is one type of strawberry in the name, one variety, the name eludes me, but the mother plant can produce up to 120 daughters in a year. So it's a great way to kind of make more friends that way. And there's another great picture of, there's the mother plant with that above ground stem connecting to that daughter. So fibrous roots, they come in two main different types of root structures. You have your clumping roots and then your spreading roots. So first we're going to talk about the clumping roots. So the prime example of those is your astilbes, your daylilies, your hostas, and your ornamental grasses. So when do you divide these guys? Obviously, for landscaping reasons, like I said, maybe you want to spread those plants out and, put them in your lawn. Free plants, you can never argue with that. But for health reasons. So like I was saying, when you start to get too many plants within a clump, they start to compete with each other. And then they're competing for that light, they're competing for that water, those nutrients. And so overall the plant is less vigorous. So you'll see a decrease in flowering. You can see, like I said, yellowing of leaves. But the big one that you see, and we get a lot of these questions where people send pictures of their ornamental grasses, and it's a nice perfect circle, and inside's just dead, and the grasses are all around the circle. That's a prime example of a plant that needs to be divided, right? So you would divide it, and then you would have a nice vigorous clump of grass again. So the general rule of thumb is to divide perennials every 3 to 5 years. Obviously that, that's not a hard and fast rule. If the growing conditions are great, your plant's very vigorous, maybe you have to divide more often, maybe the light isn't so great, maybe it's a bit too dry and it isn't growing as vigorously, you might, have to divide later. But either way, you can kind of look at it and gauge based on some of those health reasons and also some design reasons. So the best time to divide plants is, well, one of the best times is now. So if the plant is a spring flowering perennial, then you divide in the fall. But if it's, summer or fall flowering perennial, or, like a hosta, now is the best time to divide. So this weekend, coming up in April is the best time to divide these guys. In most cases, you divide the spring bloomers in around September. That gives them time to establish a root structure before a freeze. But it's past their flowering time, so they'll be able to focus a lot of their attention on growing those root structures. Later blooming perennials should be separated about right now in April. As soon as some new growth is detected, you can divide these perennials, and hostas are a great example of that. You can hostas are one of those resilient guys that you can divide other times, but be aware that depending on the plant, depending on the flowering time, this could impact their flowering or could impact their vigor later. So just something to keep in mind, but it can be done, right? Again, with plants, everything could be done if you put your mind to it. So some key things to remember when you divide. You want it to be cool outside. You want it to maybe be a little bit wet. At the very least, try to do it in the morning so the plant has had some time overnight to kind of plump up and get some water. You don't want to do it when it's like bright middle of the day sun, because the longer that root structure is out in that heat and in that air, the more detrimental it is for that root structure. Yeah. So how do you divide a perennial? So let's start with this fibrous roots, this clumping root structure. And let's take a hosta because, those are the best ones to divide. So I'm no Don, if you guys were all on last week. I was unable to make a video of this, but I do have some pretty great pictures. So first what you do is you take your spade, your shovel that now is nice and sharp after Don's talk, now you know. So it's nice and sharp, and you kind of ring the plant. So you circle the plant and separate any of those roots that are branching out, and then you pry up from underneath and kind of lift it out of the hole, lift that perennial out of the hole. So clumping root systems, they tend to be compact. A lot of times it's fleshy and thick, that root structure. It grows more down than out, more out than spreading. New roots arise from the buds that are attached to the original crown, and root systems are closely intertwined in these kind of plants. So the best way to divide them is to take that sharp spade that you've sharpened and just kind of divide them. So take that hosta cake right there and just divide it into pieces. A spade, a machete works. Something that's sharp and something that's clean is going to be great to do this. Also, you don't have to necessarily dig up the whole plant. You can take a wedge out of the plant when it's still in the ground. But this is probably the better way to do it. That way you can adequately gauge the proportions. Another thing is don't over divide the plant. So, try to leave a proportion amount of roots to crown. Too few roots can't support a large crown. Also, but on the same side, don't underdivide, right? Because if you start underdividing, you're going to be dividing again really soon. So you're going to be digging up, year after year after that plant if the plant's really vigorous, and keep doing that. So another example is the daylily. So this is a picture I took out of my garden. So, again, you're kind of ringing around the perennial and separating it out. And once the perennial has been lifted, you can place the root ball in some water, or even just use your fingers to kind of separate out a lot of those roots, separate out a lot of that dirt. And then, remove only enough soil so that you can really see into that root structure. But careful, because by doing that, by kind of like, washing it or rubbing your fingers through it, you're separating a lot of those, you're cutting off and destroying a lot of those really fine, thin roots. And those are really important for plants. That's where they get a lot of their water, a lot of their nutrients. So really try to, don't overwork it, but either way. So now it's time to divide the plants. You can see there's this clump of daylilies, and I think there was a piece of grass in there too. But then, we were able to separate out, and there was 3 little babies, and you can spread them out. They'll fan out really nice. So then we have our fibrous roots, which the other type is spreading. So the prime example of those are going to be your coreopsis, your aster, your monarda, lamb's ear, purple coneflower, your black-eyed Susans, right? Those are just some examples. Obviously, it's a much bigger family than this. So a lot of the when to divide is going to be the same as the other fibrous root structure. Again, they can crowd out themselves, right? The center can die out. They can outcompete with, water and other nutrients. If you're seeing yellowing of leaves, if you're seeing, less vigorous flowers, maybe then it's time to divide. So traditionally, the best time for spring flowering, again, is the fall. And then the spring, so right about now for all other flowering plants. It's best to divide the perennials again when it's cool and wet outside on a cloudy day, ideally. You're really trying to keep that root ball moist and protected. Again, this is like every 3 to 5 years type of division. But some of these spreading root structures, they can be a bit invasive. I think as we've seen with some of I know the monarda can take over a bit. So maybe it's best to, really kind of keep on that dividing schedule. So when it comes to dividing, instead of using that sharpened spade that we saw with the hosta cake, this time, get out your digging forks. And then use some more forceful separation, right? So you can use 2 forks back to back and kind of separate out those root structures. Each new shoot is separated from the crown with a partially separate root structure. You can use a knife and cut apart, and cut apart some of these root structures, but sometimes a fork can work a little bit better. You can divide the clumps into about 3 to 5 vigorous shoots each. If the shoots look kind of sad or particularly woody, you can just discard those. All right, so let's move on to another root structure that's been interesting, and that is of rhizomes. So rhizome is a thick, fleshy stem that grows horizontally at or a little bit below ground level or dirt level. They spread out from the original plant, kind of like a spreading root structure, but they're much more thick and kind of bulbous. The best example I can use for this is the bearded iris. So obviously not all irises. Irises is a huge family, about 200 to 300 of them. And some of them require different dividing, but the bearded iris, it's what a lot of us have in our gardens. So it's a nice kind of example. So when you would divide these, again, same reasons in that, like you're seeing a decrease in growth, a decrease in vigor, but with the irises, you kind of want to be more on top of their dividing because if there's too many irises in an area, you have a decreased airflow, right? And decreased vigor makes them more susceptible to the iris borer. And so if you stay on top of dividing and are encouraging that healthy growth, they'll be unlikely to be to get infected with that. So you divide obviously every 3 to 5 years. Again, I'm going to say this over and over again, but maybe it'll stick that way. And then you can divide any time between a month after they stop flowering until early fall. So what does that look like? What does dividing look like? So step 1, get out that fork that you were using and begin by lifting the plants in the ground with that spading fork. Right, so you're going to be lifting it up. Step 2, remove the soil from the roots and inspect those rhizomes for any signs of rot or any signs of the iris borer. So this is a great example of that. You can kind of look and see, and there's a nice rhizome right there, ready for division. So I don't know if I would use a kitchen knife like this, but either way, use a sharp and clean knife, and just to discard any of the unhealthy or older rhizomes. You can see the knife is very easily just like sliding and like cutting into that rhizome. And so once you just cut that off and discard it. So it's nice for health. So you can cut the rhizomes with a length of approximately a few inches, and then you let the cut. So with the other root structures, the stress was keep them wet, keep them moist. But with these, actually, after you cut them, you leave them out for a little bit to subberize. So what that is actually it's like forming a scab, right? It's a buildup of a cork structure to kind of protect that rhizome from anything entering it. So you leave it out in the sun for a bit to kind of allow it to create that structure, about a day or two. So then you can trim back the foliage about 5 inches, shorten any roots if needed. This is a great example. They're on the tin, or they're laying out on some newspaper in some sun to just kind of, they're freshly cut. You can see by the nice bright white area. And then they're going to create they're going to create that cork structure. So when you replant these plants, so I'm going to talk a little bit more at the end about replanting, unless there's something specific, and rhizomes are a bit specific. So when you replant them, make sure they're part of the rhizome is showing above the soil level, so you're not going to be digging them deep down and submerging them. Obviously, you plant them in sunny, well-drained soil. Irises, they do love their sun. But really try to, and they really thrive when they have some of that rhizome, allowed to bake in that sun. So be conscious of that. Also, try to, put your rhizomes at a level in which they had come out of the ground at. So if they were, sitting a bit more out of the dirt, then plant these guys a little bit out of the dirt as well. So kind of try to keep that consistent.
Kayla, I just want to interrupt for a second. We're getting some background sounds, and I'm not sure if you can mitigate that on your end. Everybody else is on mute, so I'm assuming it's just coming from your background, and I'm going to mute myself again. Just a heads up. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So after a few weeks, the plants actually will recover from transplanting and they'll resume some new growth. So again, plants are pretty resilient. So the next root structure is tuberous roots. And so this one, the prime example, there's the dahlias, but the prime example for this is going to be your peonies. I'm going to focus on the peony because they're a bit interesting. So I keep saying this, 3 to 5 years, 3 to 5 years. But peonies are interesting in that you can leave them for a while. They don't necessarily need to be divided. Some can last up for 50 years without division. So again, one of those key things you're going to see is a decrease in the flowering, the amount of flowering. But also sometimes if your peonies are getting a lot of diseases, some ways you can try to mitigate that is through division. So maybe there's something going on, maybe it's trying to outcompete, and so it's resulting in less vigor and then an increase in diseases. So this is one way you can try to do that. Obviously there's a whole bunch of other diseases that we're not going to talk about. It could be a whole lecture in of itself. So peonies, the best time to divide them is, so they're essentially dormant by mid-August. So you can divide when their foliage is still green later in the fall. So mid-September to early October is probably the best time to start doing these guys. So the first step is to remove the foliage, just cut it right off, like the green leaves. And then, dig out the entire plant, kind of like what we did with that hosta cake. But then this time, instead of just, hacking it up, you're going to wash the roots and really try to get them as clean as possible, because one of the things you want to be able to identify are these eyes. So these eyes, they're little pink buds. There's a diagram right here that you can kind of see, and I'm trying to see if you can see them on this picture clearly. But see, the reason why you want to be able to see these eyes is because this is going to guide the way in which you divide this plant. So peony roots are really tough. So make sure your tool is clean, your tool is sharp, right? And now, again, we know how to sharpen them. And they're,
Is that what you argued about?
Oh yeah, I am getting.
He had no sense of responsibility. He just breezed through
Hold
life,
on, let me
leaving the rest
just.
of us in his way.
There we go. Sorry, someone was unmuted. Okay, so, oh, that just derailed me. All right, so peony roots are tough. You want to, use a clean blade. And what you want to do is you want to be able to identify where these eyes are. And so when you divide, you want at least 3 eyes to be on that division. And there's a reason for this. And when you have those 3 eyes, any less than that, there's a reduced likelihood that that plant will flower the next year. So if you have those 3 eyes, that's kind of the rule of thumb that your peony will be able to flower the next year. When you plant these divisions, they can also be stored for the next year. So they're not, again, it's not one of those plants like the hostas that we want to get in the ground right away. These can be stored for the next year. But when you replant, you want to do several things. So you want to make sure those eyes, those little pink buds, are around 1 to 2 inches deep in firmed soil. So it means the soil has been pressed down. If you plant them in soil that's kind of fluffy, when you water, it will sink down and then those eyes will be too deep. And the reason that we don't want those eyes to be too deep is because that can result, even if it's those 3 eyes, those 3 buds, it can result in reduced flowering or potentially no flowering, right? So just be cognizant of that. So the next type are bulbs and corms, and I grouped these together because they look very similar. So you have your true bulbs, your daffodils, like this picture here, your tulips, your hyacinths, your amaryllis, etc. So those are complete plants within a tiny little package, tiny little bulb. They produce stems from the base of the bulb, and they survive from year to year. And then you have your corms, your crocus, your freesia, your gladiolus. Generally, they're short squat stems full of food tissue storage. Food storage tissue. So you divide these for the same reason as other plants. There can be crowding, landscaping reasons. So a lot of energy from that mother bulb goes into producing and caring for those little bulbs or the little corms, resulting in sometimes just green leaves coming up and no flowering from that mother bulb. So obviously the remedy is to divide. And so this is also one of my neighbors. This is a great example. This probably started off years ago with one single bulb. And you can see all the babies ringing the outside. And then in the middle, you can see that, there's one flower, but there's a lot of green space. And so maybe this is, time to divide this plant. But also if you divide it, then you can kind of spread it across this area, right? So the best time to separate bulbs is after the flower blooms have faded, but while the leaves are still green. So you can kind of see them. In daffodils and tulips, which again are true bulbs, the babies are called offsets or bulblets or daughter bulbs. And they grow around the main bulb. New shoots will emerge from these bulblets alongside the parent shoot. So as the year progresses, and as you saw in that last picture, the baby bulbs will eventually completely surround the mother bulb. Corms are very similar. The cormals form around the base of the mother corm. It's a little pea-shaped cormal, and they remain attached until eventually they can also kind of break off too. So this is a picture of my amaryllis. You can see there's a nice little baby growing off the side. So how do you divide? You dig them up, obviously, and you cut the leaves off, and then you rinse the bulbs carefully, right? And so a lot of times the offsets or the bulbets or the cormals, they'll be very abundantly clear. Sometimes they'll fall off when you're digging them up, but you can just pry them off gently with your fingers as well. And then you can replant the bulbs in their new places, or keep them for next year, store them properly. Yeah, so it's obviously not necessary to wait until there's a decline in health, until there's like lack of flowering. But if you just kind of want more plants, you can always do this. So afterwards, you have to plant the division, and so obviously we have some specific guidance, like I said, with the peonies. Again, the 3 eyes 1 to 2 inches below the surface, but let's think about the grasses or hostas, water the plant before you divide it, right? You want it to be nice and moist and, have a proper amount of water. So water it before or do it, in the morning so it has had time over the night to kind of have enough water. And then also prepare the future bed. Ideally, if you're going to be using it in your own garden, prepare the future bed for that plant to live in, right? So you're going to be digging that hole initially. You kind of know where it's going to be going to minimize that time that it's spent out of the ground. Roots that are exposed to the air, they tend to dry out very quickly, and then they can die. They can die back, right? So we kind of want to avoid that. If it has to be kept out of the ground, maybe a friend's coming over later to pick it up, or wrap the root ball in some wet burlap, or cover it in a thick layer of wet mulch, and just kind of try to keep that root structure moist. Another thing you can do is you can cut back some of the leaves. That way they can minimize the amount of water that's going to be lost. But so when you're replanting, dig the hole about twice as large as the root ball, and slightly deeper. And then leave whatever soil is already on that root ball, right? So remember we were talking about those thin little roots that are so important to their survival. If you're going to be kind of like trying to get rid of that original dirt, you're going to be disturbing those. So, leave that original root ball with the dirt, drop it in its new home, and, backfill the dirt until it sits, at or like a slightly above the previous soil line. Ideally, what you'd like to do is when you transplant this plant or when you divide it, when you replant it, it sits at the same level that it was sitting before. That way, it kind of minimizes any more stress to the plant. So, obviously keep it well watered. And when you transplant it, try to really push that soil down. You want to minimize the amount of air pockets that are in that soil. So if any of those roots are exposed to an air pocket, those roots are going to die. So you want to harden that soil down, dampen that soil down, and then, water them pretty generously. Some people will say, I want to fertilize it, I put it through a traumatic experience. And if you're going to do that, use a fertilizer that's low in nitrogen, so like a 0-10-10, for example. You do this because the nitrogen is going to cause the plant to focus on its vegetative state, its plant, its leaves, and you really want that plant to be focusing on its root structure to prepare it for winter. So if you're going to fertilize, low or no nitrogen. If you're planting in fall, it's a good idea to kind of cover that plant with a bunch of mulch, cover the root structure with a bunch of mulch to kind of start preparing, especially if it didn't have enough time to really start building its root structure before freeze, to really kind of help protect it as well. But yeah, give your plant time to grow its new roots. Give it water when needed. Be careful, don't overwater it. There's tendency to kind of fuss with it because you've disturbed it. But too much water can cause root rot and fungus growth. So just be cognizant of that as well. So be kind to them, but just don't fuss them. They're plants. They're pretty resilient. Like I said, they'll do stuff that you never thought they could do. But yeah, so dividing perennials, it's an easy way to rejuvenate them, to control their growth, control your landscape, and make new friends by giving them plants. But yeah. So that's kind of all I had here. I would love to hear your guys' thoughts or any questions. And again, we're part of the Master Gardener system. So if there's anything more specific, you can always email Master Gardener. I'm sure Nayra put that in the chat as well. But with that, I'd love to hear your questions. I'd love to hear insights, or if someone has great tips on how to best divide some peonies, I'd love to hear it as well.
So Kayla, I want to first thank you so much for putting this presentation together. This is a new talk that is presented through the Illinois Master Gardener program, and you and Nayra did such a nice job at bringing this content to life for us. It's a topic that's never really been covered, especially by the Friends of the Oak Park Conservatory. So that was a lot of information. We do have some questions that have come through. So I'm going to and Nayra was so great. She was trying to answer them in the chat. So tag teaming is great. Taylor was curious about the strawberries that you mentioned early in the presentation. And the question was, when you're dividing them, they're connected. You called it the stolon, I believe. And the question was, do we disconnect it from the mother plant? Like, is it required that if you're moving the strawberries around, do we have to disconnect the stolon, cut it?
So you don't have to. I think there's a great picture I saw online, and I have seen this too in real life, in which there was like a mother plant, and then they'll kind of send them anywhere. And so you can actually, once they send those daughters out, you can kind of dig up a little bit and put them into their own pots, still connected. Wait till that root structure is really intact, and then cut them. And then you have plants to give away. That's one way to do it. That way they're already within their own dirt. They're already within, and then you just snip them and send them on. But it's not necessary. I mean, I have strawberries that I've never done this. I mean, maybe I should be doing this, but I have strawberries that I've never done this, and they've grown wild. So maybe I should be doing it. But yeah, it's not necessary. But.
Okay, great. I have strawberries that almost act like a ground cover now. There's so many of them, and I just kind of dig them out and space them out a little bit, and I've been known to give them away. Okay, great. So I think we may have addressed some of this, but let me just bring it up again to be sure. If you have a spring flowering plant and you can't help yourself and you need to divide that plant, even though it's spring flowering, can you divide it in the springtime? And another person had that same question, but referenced the Siberian iris. So if you could just, again, remind us of the spring flowering plants.
Yeah, so a lot of the spring flowering, ideally, you would divide them in the fall when the flowering isn't there. But, again, I want to stress that you can divide them at any time, but it may significantly impact that flowering, and it may impact the plant, right? So if you're going to be dividing when they're in bloom, it may either ruin the bloom, or it might decrease the rate in which the plant is going to be growing those root structures, because it's going to be focusing on its bloom. So that's why they say the springs flowering, you do them in the fall, and then everything else you do in the spring before it's going to be. So.
Okay. And again, at the top of the presentation, I don't know if you were in the room when I was saying this, but I was saying that I'm an experimental gardener. And so I don't invest, I invest a lot of time in it, but I also say to myself, let's try it and see what happens. And so if you have a few irises, or you've got some plants that you want to experiment with, and you won't feel awful if they don't come back fully, then I think the spirit is, give that a try and see how it goes. But this is good. These are kind of good practices that we're trying to give to everybody. Okay, I think Christy had a question about when she was dividing some non-blooming daffodils. She divided them and there were no flowers that were coming back up. So the question kind of rests on, should she have added some amendments, or what do you know? And I'm not sure if you can answer that one or not, but what do you know about?
I think my first question would be, what was the size of the bulbs that you planted? So, you have your original mother, and then you have the daughters all around. And sometimes those daughter bulbs can be very small, and some of those guys won't give you flowers the first year, depending on, the size of them. Obviously I don't know. That's one of the things I think about initially, is what were those size of those babies that you planted, which that might be normal, might be natural. So that's one thought I have. I don't know, and I don't I don't know enough to recommend adding any sort of amendment to the soil, but that would be my first thought. Okay. It might be normal, it might be natural, it might be just based on the size of the bulb.
Okay. So again, Christy, I see your note here. Thank you so much for chiming back in. So give it a try, and then don't invest too much hope in it, and you'll see if it comes back up. So she was just saying they were rescued from a neighbor. Okay, I'm going to go on to another question. There was something about bleeding hearts. I don't know if he specifically talked about them. And I don't know what root structure they would fall under, but there was a question about bleeding hearts. So let's see who asked that, and maybe I can ask her to unmute. Was it Gina? I don't know if it was Gina. Okay. If you asked about bleeding hearts, please let me know, and we'll, yeah, it was Christy again. Christy, do you want to
Um,
unmute?
Yeah,
What
thank you. Thank you. I think the question was answered when we circled back on what would happen if I did. I mean, I
Okay.
have some that are blooming now, so I wouldn't want to divide those, but I have others in a cooler part of the garden that are, up only about 6 inches. So I was wondering if I could divide them, but it sounds like I'll go with what you're saying and just try it and see what happens.
Well, you could do that. I have found bleeding hearts to be a little finicky. Kayla or Nera, do you have any more, at least finicky in my garden? Do you guys have any more expertise that we can offer around the bleeding heart?
Yeah, so Naira added some. She said they should be divided in the spring every 6 to 10 years. They will seed, but cut the crown apart with a sharp knife. So I was thinking that bleeding hearts are probably a fibrous root structure, so you probably could just cut them apart. But sorry. So I was thinking that probably the way you do it, and that's what Naira is suggesting as well. Roots are brittle, so handle carefully. There was a question about the Hellebores, I see.
I haven't
And
got that yet.
Oh,
Hold on
sorry.
a second.
Okay. I got excited about the Hellebores. I love those plants.
Okay, well, why don't you go ahead, because I don't want to stamp on your enthusiasm there. We'll come back to you, Sue, but Mary Jo asked about hellebores and how those could be divided. And those are a beautiful flower that is really in bloom right now. So it's an early spring bloom.
Yeah, so those are rhizome as well. So you would probably follow the rhizome structure for that. But yeah, they're pretty easy to divide. I've done it before. Again, you kind of ring it up, ring the perennial, dig it up, and then divide it as you would a rhizome.
Okay. Great. So there was a question regarding rooting hormones or vitamins. So if you're dividing your plants, is there a rule of thumb about amendments such as rooting hormones or vitamins that you would specifically consider adding? I know you mentioned compost as a way to kind of make sure that that space going where the plant is going is going to be nice and healthy soil. What are your thoughts? And if you don't have them, we can certainly defer to the Illinois Extension.
So the big thing I know is just don't add nitrogen. You want to stay a little bit away from the nitrogen because you don't want them to focus their energy on flower, on foliage growth. But besides that, I mean, maybe I'm really mean to my plants. Like when I was like learning more about this, I was like, oh, I think I'm kind of mean. Cause I'm like, yeah, they'll figure it out. Like, hostas will get over it. So I haven't added anything, but maybe that's a question we could ask, the bigger resource of the master gardeners, because I honestly, I don't know.
Okay. Okay, great. So we can provide future information in that. So this is an interesting question for those of us that have kind of larger plants, and it looks like it would be the right time to divide them. I'll throw out hosta or sedum. So you've got these larger plants that are growing. Should you take pieces from the periphery rather than lift the entire plant out? Does it stress the entire plant, or is it actually recommended to take that whole plant out like you did with the cake demonstration? What do you recommend when you've got kind of a bigger thing?
I mean, honestly, both were recommended. So you could dig up the whole plant and, divide it out into the little pieces, if that's what you want to do. That being said, I can't always lift the hostas, right? Like I have to bring my husband in. And so like if it were up to me, I would just cut pieces out of them and move on. But, if it's crowding out other plants, then just taking a slice isn't going to fix that. So then you might want to dig it up and kind of, cake it, cut it in those pieces and then put the smaller piece of the cake back. That would be my thought around it. If anyone has any other insights, I would love to hear it.
Okay, great. So I have a question about Baptisia. I think I have a beautiful blue Baptisia that's growing in my garden, and it just gets bigger. It's so happy there. It just gets bigger, bigger, bigger each year. I believe from what I know, at least about the native Baptisia, is that it has a long, deep taproot and it doesn't like to be moved. But if this plant just keeps getting bigger and bigger, what is the best way? Do I just cut it back? Because I don't think I'm actually going to be able to divide it if it's a single taproot. What?
Yeah, that was one of the so when I was doing research for this, the false indigo was one of the ones that I kept reading that they said don't divide because of that.
Okay.
But if it's I mean, I'm wondering if you were to look at the base of it, is it all coming off? Kind of like how the lavender, it comes from that single base and it just like branches out and gets bigger and bigger and it spreads. And so maybe trimming back would be the better option. But maybe just looking at the bottom of it to really see. But again, I just kept reading that they might not enjoy that, but
Yeah.
maybe.
Yeah.
But I'm sure. That being said, I'm sure someone has done it, and someone is like, yeah, no problem. Like I divided it, it's happy as clam, and you're like, okay.
Yeah, I just, if anybody has experience with that, I might just trim it back. So Ellen shared with us that her favorite tools for dividing are the hatchet and the small saw. So just some tips from another master gardener and fellow board member.
Okay, yeah.
I don't see any other specific questions in the chat. And at this time, let me just do just kind of a little thank you and wind down, but I will offer people, if you want to continue on, you can unmute yourselves. And if you want to show us your face, you can show us your screens as well, and we can open it up for more open conversation. But at this time, I want to just first of all, again, thank Kayla and Nera for putting together this fantastic talk. It was great detail, and I learned so much every single time I get a chance to attend one of these programs. So I know you put a lot of work into it. And I just want to mention that next week we have a fantastic talk on edible gardens coming. It's another free virtual lecture just like this. And then the following week, Ellen Kuhner will be sharing container gardening with us. And that will feature some of the plants that are for sale in our annual plant sale. On May 18th, we will be answering all of your garden questions in a Q&A format, kind of coffee talk style, with Don Necrocious and Sandy Lentz and the Oak Park Conservatory staff. And so that one will be, if you've got all these burning questions and you don't know what to do, that's a great time to join us. And that'll be on a Tuesday evening.